Hi, I'm Dina Altieri. Welcome to Chef in the Garden. Today we're going to make a very special soup with a fantastic seasonal local ingredient. But I have a riddle for you first. What has 500 to 1,000 kernels, tassel, some ears, and silk? Have you guessed it? Corn. So today we're going to make a sweet corn chowder, which is a very, very popular recipe. Sorry if that riddle was a little corny, but I grew up in New England, and this is an area of the United States that is pretty famous for something called New England clam chowder. But instead of clams, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it with some really beautiful sweet corn from right here in Arizona. So the first thing we need to do when we're making a corn chowder is produce something called, a stock or a broth that would be a flavorful liquid that would essentially be sort of the backbone of that soup or that recipe that we're doing. So let's go ahead and start with the ear of corn. So what we're going to do is, grabbing that top tassel there, we're going to begin by pulling or shucking the corn. Earlier we did the little riddle and we learned that 500 to 1,000 kernels could be in this corn cob, which is just amazing. That tassel up top there, when you're looking for the ripeness of corn in terms of when to harvest it, those dark areas are actually a sign that the corn is ready to be harvested. Each of these little pieces of silk are pollinating each of those kernels of corn. And on the plant itself, there are many, many ears. So those were our key riddle clues earlier. So we're going to go ahead and shuck the corn. Again, from the top down. I love that squeaky sound it makes too. Food is so audible. It's pretty special. So there we go. See all of the kind of the husk, right, of that corn has been peeled away. And now we're left with these little pieces of silk. We're going to want to take this to the vegetable washing sink and go ahead and rinse off the silk. So now that we have all of our vegetables washed and cleaned and the corn has been shucked and cleaned, we're going to go ahead and build basically the corn stock or the corn broth. So what we want to do is, this recipe calls for 3 ears of corn. And the first step is to take each of those ears and cut them in half. And one thing I like to do is I get my knife about halfway through and then I just sort of bend that knife in a sense, kind of pivot it, and the corn will cut sort of in half. What we're looking for is a nice flat side where we can set that corn kind of on the cutting board in a very, sort of position that is very safe, right? Because sometimes if we have the corn positioned like this, it might wobble. So I like to do a half so that we're in a situation that's always really safe when we're working with our knives. And remember, always have an adult present when you're using knives. So the first step is to remove the corn from what might be fondly called the bone, right? Like if we're making stock, sometimes we think about stock having bones, right? But the corn doesn't have a bone really, but there is a little cob inside, which eventually will go into that pot there and become part of that flavorful liquid. But notice here all these beautiful kernels that have been removed from that corn cob. So all I'm doing here is I'm practicing some good knife safety. Couple things to point out. My pinch grip, really making sure I've got a good handle on my knife. I'm a righty, so that's what's happening in my right hand. And then in my left hand, I've got my claw, right? My fingers aren't doing this. My fingers are rolled back so that the knife is positioned against a knuckle and I'm working really safely. Okay, so we have removed all of the corn kernels from the cobs. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and we're going to divide out this corn into 1 cup for pureeing and 2 cups for later for our soup. I'm going to just do it by eye because I can see 1/3 versus 2/3. And essentially what I'll do is I'll put it in this bowl for the soup, and I will put it in this bowl for the puree. Before we go any further, let's go out into the garden and see how the corn that we're using for today's recipe is planted.
Thanks, Chef Dina. I'm going to show you how to plant that corn that you're cooking with. My name is Bob McClendon. I'm an organic farmer from the West Valley. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of corn. Corn was cultivated by man 7,000 years ago in central Mexico. Corn originated from a plant called tecinte, and tecinte is a grass, a wild grass, that had a small cob and a husk and a few little kernels of corn on it. And the early Aztecs, 7,000 years ago, started propagating, harvesting that, and growing it. What happened over time is that man has taken that and pollinated it, cross-pollinated it, and basically created the corn that we have today, which is full-bodied corn on the cob. All the ears are filled out. There's two varieties. There's a white and then there's a yellow corn. Planting corn is very, very easy. One of the easiest vegetables to grow that I know of. And corn seed is harvested from the cob. After the corn dries on the cob, you can then separate the little seed from it, and it's so simple to plant. The depth that you plant corn is somewhat important. Take your index finger, and the last joint would be as deep as you would want to plant corn. If it's too shallow, it will dry out and won't germinate well. You don't want to plant it too deep, because then it can't come to the surface and start making a leaf. You just plant it about 1 inch to 3/4 of an inch deep in nice moist soil, cover it up, and then it just takes a little water from there. The little seed will start sprouting in about a week to 10 days, depending on the moisture. Then it will grow very, very fast. Corn is going to get fairly large. It needs to be at least 12 inches apart, and even then the different corn stalks will touch each other. You want to put it in a large pot or in a garden bed where there's lots of room to grow it. Corn is an interesting plant in that it needs a lot of heat, a lot of warmth to grow. It won't grow here in the desert in the wintertime at all because it's too cold. So we plant corn in the summer and in the fall. It will take 60 to 70 days to produce 2 nice cobs of corn on the sides, one on each side of the plant. You'll know corn is ready to harvest when you can take your hand and put on the ear of corn and give it a little tug to the side. If it snaps off with a snap, that corn is ripe. If it won't give the corn to you and without a lot of force, it is not ready yet. Good luck on planting your corn. I can't wait to taste Chef Dina's corn chowder.
Thanks. So since you're planting your corn in late summer, it should be ready to harvest in November. That's going to be so exciting and so wonderful to enjoy. And next in the recipe, we're going to go ahead and we're going to build the corn broth or the corn stock. So one of the things we always want to think about when we're making a flavorful liquid is it's liquid plus the essential ingredients and something that are called aromatics. So when I think about something that is an aromatic, I think about something that gives a beautiful and full aroma. So notice the things on my cutting board here that will become the aromatic components in this stock. So one of the aromats is a black peppercorn, and your recipe calls for approximately 12. So you can sort of eye what 12 peppercorns might look like in your hand and go ahead and add those in. Calls also for 3 sprigs of thyme. Thyme is a beautiful herb you can grow in your garden, and that would be a sprig. So there are 3 of those. 1 bay leaf. Again, if it's a small bay leaf, you can add 2. Certainly going to add some aroma there. And then the final aromatic ingredient is basically a parsley stem. So when you purchase parsley and you wash it, you're going to see something that looks like this, right? A pluche or a small sprig. What you're going to want to do is just go ahead and pinch that nice fresh parsley leaf off of the stem and then make a nice little pile of stems like that. And one of the things I'll do when I'm making a stock a lot of times is I'll cut my stems into halves or thirds, and I'll go ahead and I'll put them in like that. So far we've got the corn cobs in there, we've got the aromatic ingredients, and I'm just using low sodium vegetable broth here. I'm starting with a vegetable broth, which is my preference for making this soup. Typically when you're making a stock, the liquid just covers the ingredients in the primary recipe. So in this particular case, because I'm using corn cobs, they're kind of floating and bobbing. If I were to stick my hand in there and lower down those corn cobs, I would see that the level of liquid is about an inch covering the corn. So when you're making this particular recipe, you want to bring it to a boil. And again, make sure there's an adult present when you're using your range top. But you're going to want to just see some bubbles, and then you're going to want to turn that burner down so that it maintains what I would say a lazy bubble or a slow simmer. When you're cooking a stock, the intention is to draw flavor slowly. So the slower and longer it cooks, the more flavor you will have. So now let's get ready to build the chowder. When I think about making a soup, I kind of think about things pretty simply. Soups are either thin or thick. Chowder's a thick soup. So when I make this particular chowder, I am using a very heavy pan that is actually a cast iron pan. Some might call this a Dutch oven. This is not an essential pan for a chowder, but I like it because it's heavy bottomed. And the reason why I've chosen this pan is because I don't want any of the ingredients in my chowder to burn, right? So the heavier the pan is, the more sturdy it is, the more likely you are going to be able to control the heat in that pan. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna get started by putting a little bit of olive oil in our pan. And I would go over a nice medium heat. The recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of olive oil, but really the most important thing here is it's only enough olive oil to coat the bottom of the pan. No more, no less, right? So a lot of times when you're cooking and you're following a recipe and the recipe says use 2 tablespoons and you put 2 tablespoons in there and you go, wow, that's not really coating the bottom of the pan. It's more important to understand how much you're adding and the reason why. So in this particular case, the olive oil in the bottom of the pan needs to coat the bottom of the pan. Onions. We're gonna do a small dice of onion. And we've learned that before, and that's a very critical size when we're making this soup because we want to make sure that the onions are going to cook relatively quickly in the sense that if there were big chunks of onions, not only would this soup take hours and hours to cook, but also think about a soup. What utensil do you usually use to eat a soup? You usually use a spoon. So if there's an ingredient that's bigger than the spoon, it wouldn't be great for a soup, right? So when we think about making soups, we usually are using a small dice of something or a medium dice of something. So first step, medium heat, enough fat to coat the bottom of the pan, the small dice onion goes in. Another ingredient that's really important to the why of cooking. This recipe calls for adding a pinch of salt right now. Reason for that is, cooking is very scientific. And when you add salt to something, you actually draw moisture from it. And if you're listening right now, what you probably heard is first, it was just kind of a soft sizzle, and now it's really sizzling. That's because there is more moisture coming out of those onions and creating that sizzle sound. Listen to those culinary clues. Sizzling sound means moisture is interacting with that hot pan. So we're gonna let those onions cook down a little bit. One of my favorite things to do is to silence that sizzle a little bit and put a lid on it. What that's doing is that's gonna trap some of that moisture and create an environment that we call sweating, right? So literally speaking, those onions are releasing moisture. That moisture is hitting the top lid of that pan, dribbling back down and creating a very moist environment. So we're sweating the onions in that step. Okay, so one of the things to pay attention to is when you sort of stop hearing that sizzle, you know that there's really no more moisture left in those onions. So it's time to add that small dice of celery. We're gonna be gently stirring that celery in there. And one of the things that I really enjoy pointing out is the fact that you know, cooking is so interactive that there's some good smells happening right here, right? This gentle sweating of the ingredients. And one of the things I notice too is if I feel like I need a little bit more fat in the pan, I am absolutely entitled to drizzle a little bit more of that olive oil in there so that those pieces of celery and those pieces of onion can gently cook in the pan. It's okay to have a little bit of coloration, but we don't really want these to caramelize. So a little bit more fat, keep them moving, turn the heat down, really in a good place. So now that the celery is in there, the next step here is going to be to make the roux. And one of the things that we're going to use is we're going to use a half a cup of flour in this particular pot to make what's called roux, which is the thickening agent here. One of the things you do have to do though is you have to add a little bit more fat to the pan in order to make that roux the most perfect thickening ingredient. So this is margarine, right? Or basically a vegan butter. We're gonna put in 2 tablespoons. And because it's margarine, it has a little bit of moisture. And so we start to hear that soft sweating again. And we start to see that fat coating those vegetables beautifully. And now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add about a half a cup of flour. This is a situation where I would definitely measure. Because when you're making roux, it is a carefully formulaic ingredient. It's not just let's just add a little flour and figure it out. It's exactly in this recipe that half cup of flour. And you're gonna notice right away when I'm stirring it in here is it starts to grab on the bottom of the pan. Do you see that? Those are beautifully sweated vegetables that are now being coated in that flour, and the fat and everything now really looks like one homogeneous mixture, right? It's not like there's a bunch of extra fat or grease pooling anywhere. There's not any vegetables that are stuck. It's all just this lovely kind of floury, roux-coated vegetable situation. So you're basically at this point going to go very low on your burner, and you're just gently going to cook that roux. You have to be careful here because you do not want it to brown. So this flour and butter mixture or flour and margarine mixture, see it? It's really kind of coating that spoon, but we're just gonna barely cook it. Maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes. All right, let's have a peek at our corn stock. Let's go check it out. After we've determined that the corn stock has simmered for an appropriate amount of time, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna strain it. So one of the things you're gonna see is, you know, a bowl or something that's going to capture all of the liquid that I'm straining through this strainer, which is somewhere between a china cap and a chinoise in terms of how fine the mesh is. But really, when you choose a strainer, the thing you want to be paying attention to is what am I trying to strain, right? So I only need a strainer that is going to capture these sprigs of herbs and peppercorns and things. So the reality is really just needs to be as fine of a strainer as necessary for what it is that you are straining. So we're going to use a whisk to incorporate the corn stock, and I've chosen a whisk that has rubber-coated tines so that I'm not disturbing the bottom of this pan. This is an enameled cast iron pan, and it's been around in my family for a little while here. And if I'm using a metal whisk, it sometimes will scratch the bottom of that pan and kind of compromise the integrity of the interior of that pan. So we're going to slowly add that corn stock while whisking. You can stop, put it down, right, and get a grip on that pan and just catch up for a minute. It doesn't have to be like a steady stream of sort of letting that corn stock get into your soup. See how it's already thickening beautifully like that? That's because we have the stock adding into that roux that we made earlier. So here I am, I'm just adding it kind of incrementally, kind of slowly, kind of getting it in there like that. And just stirring it really carefully kind of around the interior and whisking. Typically when you're working with a thickening agent and you're making kind of this chowder base here, the whisk is kind of the magic ingredient, right? The magic tool, because without whisking, you're gonna get lumps. And if you notice, as I'm whisking, look at how beautifully silky this chowder base is. I mean, it's really a lovely kind of almost like a beige or not even a brown, just a very, very neutral color. That's how we can tell we sweated the vegetables appropriately. That's how we could tell we don't have caramelized vegetables, because that would be much, much darker if we didn't do that step properly. Now we've got that nice chowder base, sweated onions, sweated celery. We used salt to help that process. We added a lid during that process to encourage that moisture. We made a roux using fat and flour, and now we're adding our beautiful stock that repurposed those lovely flavorful corn cobs. One of the things I do when I'm cooking is, even though I'm eventually going to use all of this stock, is I'm gonna stop now and let this soup kind of come up to a simmer. So you do want to make sure that you are managing the heat of your pan. So anytime you see simmering and bubbling, you do want to feel the bottom of that pan, and my pan is doing good, right? If you felt like there was a little bit of sticking, you might want to either turn your pan off or definitely moderate that heat. So that's exactly what you want it to be doing, just that nice little simmering. Okay, so now that we've basically created that nice base for the chowder, we're ready to start adding the other ingredients. When I think of a chowder, I think of really 2 or 3 ingredients that are just absolutely necessary. One is potatoes, and for this particular recipe, I'm using a petite red potato, and I'm not peeling them. I like that red skin on there, and this is a waxy potato, which is nice for a chowder because when you're eating the chowder, you can still tell that those are nice potatoes. They're not, disintegrating in there, breaking up in there. They're really gonna kind of hold their shape and hold their integrity. And when you're doing your medium dice, you do not need to square off those potatoes. It's okay that they're naturally rounded and have some corners on them. That's good. Let them be potatoes in that soup, right? So the potatoes are gonna go in, and again, look at how gorgeous that is. Nothing is sticking. It's got a great consistency. We can see those sweated onions and that celery, and now those potatoes are in there. They have joined the party. So next ingredient is, remember all that shucked corn that we created from the corn kernels that we cut away? That corn is going into the chowder now. And remember that when we use the 3 ears of corn, 2 of the ears of corn are being added now, and 1 ear of corn is going to be pureed with some milk in just a moment. So now we can really start seeing this soup kind of coming into its own. See all that great texture in there, and see the corn? It's just gonna be gorgeous. So our next step is, remember we talked about aromatics before? Well, here we are again, right? We want to make sure that the soup has seasoning, and so we want to start by adding a little bit of salt, and I'm using a coarse kind of kosher salt here so I can really feel it in my fingertips. I want to make sure that I'm not adding too much, so I'm going to add salt incrementally. In other words, a little at a time, and then I'm going to add a little bit of fresh cracked black pepper. I'm going to go ahead and add another bay leaf. Remember, there was a bay leaf in that corn stock earlier, and some fresh chopped thyme. Typically, a chowder has some dairy product in it. Now, something to think about for this particular recipe today, I'm going to use whole milk. But you could substitute a lactose-free solution. You could even substitute an unsweetened oat milk or soy milk. So just be thinking about, is there someone in the family that maybe has a lactose intolerance? That's an easy substitution to make at this time. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add 1 cup of corn kernels into the blender with 2 cups of milk. Right there, into a blender. If you don't have a blender, don't worry. You can use a food processor, just anything to kind of grind this corn down just a little bit. And remember, what we're shooting for is kind of like a corn sauce. It's going to have like a sauce consistency. So we're ready to add the pureed corn and milk mixture. And one of the things I would strongly urge you to think about is make sure you're adding this slowly. Think about milk and think about the fact that sometimes milk wants to curdle, right? So while we don't need to take this through any kind of a tempering step, we do need to make sure that when this corn and milk mixture is being added, that we're starting slowly and then we're increasing the speed to which we're drizzling it in there. And now what's really important is that this chowder just stays at a real kind of slow, low for the remaining cook time. Once the milk is in, you're really looking about a maximum cook time of about 10 minutes. So we're in good shape and we're ready to serve. So I'm going to serve just a single portion of this soup. And this would be a great soup to have, maybe with a little griddled sandwich or a nice piece of crusty bread. That would be a perfect accompaniment. And do you see how that corn puree just added this most beautiful, almost like velvety texture to the soup? I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. And then I'm going to garnish it just with a little bit of that green onion on there. And that is it. It is ready to enjoy. The best part is your recipe is complete, it's perfectly executed, and now you get to enjoy it. So good. The corn still has a little bit of texture to it. The sweetness is there. This is my bowl. I'm not going to share this one.